Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, How to Protect Your Assets and Loved Ones. Just waiting for everybody to join, so we'll get underway in a few moments. Hope you've all had a good start to the week. So in this workshop, I'm going to be talking about how we can protect our assets and loved ones. And achieving financial security, by protecting our assets, the money we have, whether that's for you and also for our loved ones ultimately. But also just having to think about, well, how can we overcome the things that get in our way of doing this? So we'll be looking at making wills and lasting powers of attorney. And as I say, it's one of those things where we don't like to talk about it. I think that's one thing that we struggle with, and I've certainly found that to be the case when I made my first will. Strangely, being in the profession I am, it took me a while to actually do that, believe it or not. And I think one of the reasons was due to, perhaps struggling to have the conversations about death and ill health. I'll talk a little bit more and share a bit more about my story in today's workshop. So we shall get underway. It's just gone past 12. So hopefully most have joined already. So I'm just going to share my screen now and share our slide. So just one moment. If you'd like to pop in the chat for me, whereabouts you are today from the UK, whereabouts are you listening to this workshop? I'd love to know. So feel free to pop that in the chat if anyone would like to share that. I hope the day's okay so far. I'm down in Kent, so a little bit colder, but not too bad, not too bad at all. So let me just get these slides working and then we shall get started. Okay, so we've got a few people coming in the chat. So Sheffield, West Sussex, or a few in Sussex actually, great. Essex and Norfolk are great parts of the UK. Okay, sorry, just getting my slides. There we go. I think we're all good to go. So let's get underway. Firstly, I wanted to outline why I decided to run these workshops, and I touched upon it already a moment ago. And it was born out of the fact that I see the struggles that people have when it comes to making wills and powers of attorney, and not and that may be because people don't know how to go about it, not knowing how to get started, but also perhaps not appreciating the importance of doing it and the consequences when we don't do it. And I wanted to find a way to overcome this, break it down, make it really easy to put these protections in place. So to be able to put our wills, put our powers of attorney in place. And that leads me nicely to my first question. So I'd love to know, again, just pop this into the chat for me, if you know what a will and lasting power of attorney is. So I'm sure most will know what a will is. Maybe not everybody will know what a power of attorney is. But also, do you have those conversations about ill health and dying? So if anyone would like to share in the chat for me, that would be great. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and that will give me a chance just to have a sip of water as much as doing that. So I think it's a really interesting question, particularly about conversations. Do we talk about death often enough? And equally ill health, so connected with powers of attorney. And I'll talk about the difference between a will and power of attorney later on. So, yeah, a few comments coming in. So thanks for that. So people starting to do it. We now have young children, so that's a good opportunity to really think about making wills. Again, we'll touch upon the reasons why later on in the workshop. So thank you for that. Just to perhaps mention at this point as well, I will leave some time at the end for a Q&A. If you do have any questions that spring to mind as I move through the workshop, pop them into the Q&A function for me, and then I can have a look at those, and then we'll answer those at the end. So we'll have an opportunity to have a look at those. Okay, so my aim then for this workshop, to provide as much guidance, information as I can. I'll introduce you to my How to Protect Your Assets and Loved Ones process. And as mentioned, ask as many questions as you like. I will help as much as possible. So if you do have questions, then, as I say, pop them into the Q&A. That will be fantastic. So I've been doing this about 16 years, so helping people and assisting clients with wills, estate planning, probate and power of attorney. But particularly over the last 2 years, when I started as a self-employed consultant, what I've seen is the common reasons why people fail to make wills and to make their powers of attorney, and why they struggle with this. And I've focused in on this a little bit and tried to bring out the real reasons why people weren't doing this. And I managed to identify 5 common reasons. So these are probably the most common. So the first one was having or believing that we have plenty of time to make our will and lasting power of attorney. So it's not prioritised, and we leave making it until it's too late. I think there is a misconception that we should be thinking about this perhaps in later life or as we reach a certain age. But it is relevant for any of us. We don't know what will happen to us ultimately, and for everybody, tomorrow isn't guaranteed. The second reason was, so sometimes wills are started and they're not finished. So I have clients, they really want to put their wills, they want to put their powers of attorney in place, and they start the process, but ultimately it doesn't get finished. And that is a difficulty, because they do need to be signed, they need to be witnessed in order for them to be legally binding. So often clients may say, oh, okay, I've started making my will, I've told my lawyer or my professional what I want to happen, so I'm covered now. But they aren't valid unless they've actually been signed and witnessed. The third option, which I've talked a little bit about already, is our struggle with talking about the uncomfortable. So talking about ill health, talking about dying, and maybe that's due to fear. Is our fear of discussing these issues getting in the way of doing that? The fourth one is not appreciating the importance of wills and lasting powers of attorney. And I'm going to talk about that quite a bit during the workshop, why we should have them, what's important. And then the final reason, linked to the fourth reason, is thinking that it's simple and just a document that needs to be written. So clients or people will sometimes, they won't get help, they will attempt to do it themselves, and they see see it as, you know, as this thing, this document that needs to be done. But then if we don't get the advice we need, if it's not tailored for us, then we are risking things going wrong, and it's not going to do what you want it to do. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the workshop. So just having a think about those 5 reasons, what I'd love to know, again, pop this in the chat for me. So just have a reflect on those 5 reasons and let me know which one resonates most with you. So there could be a couple of them. It might be all of them, but just let me know in the chat the number of the one which resonates the most with you, or if it's a few of them, then do let me know. So, we've got a few coming in already, so that's great. So we've got 1, 2s and 3s, another 2. Yeah, number 2. You know, that does happen quite often. We've got some more 3s coming in and some 2s again. So, well, we'll be talking about all of these reasons as we go through the workshop. So we'll be looking at them in a little bit more detail. So thank you for that. So we've somebody's mentioned 5 as well. So all of them are resonating. So as I say, we'll talk about all of these as we move through the workshop today. My overview of the session then. So I have structured the session into 3 distinct parts. So we're going to have a look at, in part 1, protection. And this is how we get started. So where exactly do we start with making our wills, making our powers of attorney? And this is the part we really need to focus on. And then in part 2, we'll look at support. And this is how do we get it right for our own individual circumstances, make sure we have the correct advice. And then in part 3, we'll have a look at decisions. So how do we get it all done? Make sure we have these protections in place. Just very briefly then, a little bit about me. For those who don't know me, so I'm a consultant solicitor at Richard Nelson and also a visiting lecturer and trainer within this area of law, so within the area of wills and probate and all the things in between. And I am on a bit of a mission to make sure everybody has protections in place and really looking, you know, really keen to educate on the importance of making wills and powers of attorney. If we're not connected already on LinkedIn, I suspect most of us most of you will be connected with me on LinkedIn. But if not, there's a code there which you can point at the screen. So do connect with me using that QR code. That will take you through to my profile on LinkedIn, and do connect as opposed to just following me. So it'd be great if we're not already connected. I'll just leave that for a moment in case anybody wants to, and again, it'll give me a chance to just have a sip of water. Okay. So before I move into the in-depth content, I wanted to address why we should be focusing on wills and lasting powers of attorney. So why now, you know, particularly now with all the difficulties we are facing at the moment? And that there are lots of reasons. And I wanted to just highlight 3 key reasons. And that is to protect our loved ones, to protect our property, our money, whatever assets we have, but also to protect our income, finances, and our business. So if we have a business, whether that's as a sole trader, whether you're self-employed, or whether you do have a company or a partnership, we want to be able to protect all of that, and also ultimately protect our income and finances. And it's useful here just to pause and reflect on the distinction between a will and power of attorney, and why they are both needed. So a will is, well, this is what I would like to happen when I pass away. So you're setting out, how are my assets going to be divided? Who are my assets going to go to? And that happens when we pass away. With a lasting power of attorney, it's an extension of that by saying, okay, this is what I would like to happen if I can no longer make my own decisions or manage my finances, manage my business if we have one, because of an illness, and whatever illness that may be. Again, I think with powers of attorney, there may be a misconception that it's for people in later life, perhaps if we get dementia, and that is certainly where they will be very useful, but we could get it at any point. So any illness that we may have, which may impair our decision-making abilities and our ability to manage our life, really. So, you know, our finances being part of that, but also some of the other important decisions. And it could be that we die without any protections in place. So again, it's important to plan ahead and plan for the future. We want to make sure that our money, our assets, they go to the correct people. They don't go to somebody we don't want them to go to. I mentioned if we own a business, we don't want the business to come grinding to a halt, which will mean loss of income and possibly loss of the business altogether. So if we do become ill, we want to be able to have a contingency in place so people can help us manage our life. And it could also be decisions about health, about care. I've talked a lot about finances, but within that, there's the day-to-day. So it could be just as simple as paying our bills, you know, paying our gas, electric, our water bills, whatever else we have, our subscriptions, our internet, our broadband. So we can keep our life going, we can keep the house running, but also to give security to those we leave behind. So we want to make sure we are planning not just for us, but also for those closest to us, so they don't have a mess to deal with when we have ultimately passed away or when we become ill. And also, who will look after the pets? So pets are such an important part of the process for animal lovers, and it's certainly a reason why I change and update my will regularly. It's just to cater for the pets. So if you do have pets, if you do have any pets, let me know in the chat. I'd love to know. So I'd say really important part of the process for animal lovers. And it's just making sure that our pets are being looked after by the correct people. And what do we want to happen? And this is an example of what happens if we don't have a will. I'm not going to stay on this slide for too long. It's really, really jam-packed and confusing, but it just illustrates the complexities. You know, if we die without a will, then we are potentially leaving assets to people we don't want. An example here, you know, a good example is people who aren't married or not in a civil partnership. So a partner, an unmarried partner, if we're not in a civil partnership, will not receive anything unless we have a will. And then if we have children and a spousal civil partner, there are some complexities there to consider. But as I say, it just goes to show how complex it can be. So how do we get started with all of this? And what do we need to do? What do we need to focus on? And this is going to be what part one is all about. So part one, protection. And this is the area that the majority don't do. So when I speak to people, when I speak with clients, these are the areas that are not being focused upon. But this will help us to actually move forward and really put these protections in place, make our wills, make our powers of attorney. And it's often because people don't take these steps. So plan is the first one. Important conversations is the second, and then making the decision and actually deciding to do this, and that's the third. And this is what I see, notice happening all the time. Most of the clients I speak to, as I mentioned earlier, this is not happening, and it's an area that we need to focus on. So most will think wills and powers of attorney are simple and easy to do, and there's lots of reasons for this. When we think about will making in general, you may have come across so many different variations in terms of price. A good example, sometimes you'll see wills advertised for £20 or whatever it may be. You can do them yourselves. But it's this idea that a will is quite simple. And when I really kind of delved into this, and more so in the last 2 years, as I mentioned at the start, once I became a self-employed consultant, there was a bit of a realization here to think, well, okay, a will is so much more than about what happens when we pass away. And it isn't just this legal document we need to do. We do need to give it some context. We really need to think about our own individual circumstances. And in order to give it some context, we need to think about, so the first 2 steps, have a think about what assets we have. So what exactly do we have? Money, property, business, whatever it may be, personal possessions. Really focus in on that, make a note, jot it all down. But also have a think about the family tree. So write down all of your family or the people closest to you, because that will allow you then to zone in and think about, okay, so these are the people who are going to be included, and these are the people who aren't, or I don't want to be. And that will also help the professional, so the lawyer, whoever's dealing with your wills and powers of attorney, that really help them to give you the advice that you need. And we want to make sure that our wishes are known. So this is what it's about. It's making sure that we can record in a tangible form what our wishes are, and then that will guide us almost. So we can have a think about, well, what do our loved ones, what do our business partners, if we have a business, what do they need to know? And this was important to John Paul and Ben. So throughout the workshop, I'm going to be going through some case studies. So just to say, first of all, for confidentiality reasons, there are no real names here. So these are examples. The scenarios I'll be sharing are examples from clients I've worked with. So typical examples from all the clients I've worked with over the years. But as I say, no real names here for confidentiality. So John Paul and Ben, they'd actually started to make their wills and lasting powers of attorney, but they did get stuck. And there were lots of things going on for John Paul and Ben, and multiple conflicting concerns. So the house that they lived in, so they had a home, the house was just in John Paul's name. They had various personal possessions, personal effects that they wanted to pass down to various people. They needed to work out who the correct people were who were going to receive these items. Some were quite valuable, some were quite sentimental. There was a lot of thought going on behind that. There was also some business interest, so that they were at or close to retirement age, I should say, but they did have a few things going on to supplement their income. So they wanted to record what they would like in the event that they both became ill, but also how they wish to be cared for in later life. So there was some advanced planning part of this exercise. They were really thinking about, how am I going to express my wishes? And the concern for the house, with it being just in John Paul's name, extended to, okay, well, what's going to happen if John Paul needed care in later life? So what options did Ben have? So they may need to think about equity release in the future, as an example. They also needed a certificate provider for lasting powers of attorney. So certificate provider is somebody who, I was going to say signs off, and is not quite the right word, but somebody who can say, when you make a lasting power of attorney, that you understand what it does, that you have the capability, so what we call mental capacity, to make that power of attorney. And you need somebody involved in that process in order to make the lasting powers of attorney. So what did we do? We really focused in on recording who was going to manage the business interest, because that was really important. We were able to do this by utilising the powers of attorney, having a letter of wishes, which is an informal document which we can put with our wills and powers of attorney, which is going to make our wishes known. And also what's going to happen if, to both of them, if John Paul became ill, if they needed care, if both of them needed care. And I acted as the certificate provider. So for all clients, when I help with powers of attorney, I will be the certificate provider. So it just means that, so for John Paul and Ben, they didn't have the stress of finding somebody to do it, explaining to them what needed to be done. And then once all this was done, once we'd done all this work together, it gave them that peace of mind and that security. They knew their assets and the important things to them was secure. And ultimately, Ben wouldn't be left without a home. So that was a key to this. When I talk with clients, part of the planning stage is having a look at how assets are owned, and if they're owned differently, so whether that's in somebody's sole name, whether that's in joint names, we need to think about, okay, what does that mean for you as a couple? So the second area that the majority don't do, so as I was talking about earlier, a lot of clients will see these are the areas that they don't focus on, they don't do. So the second is this important conversation. So having those difficult conversations. And I've touched upon this briefly already. So I do think it's a problem in society in the UK. Death is a bit of a taboo subject. We really don't want to talk about it. We may deny it. It was interesting, actually. I was listening to a podcast quite recently, and it was talking about how grief was dealt with in different cultures. And it was saying that in one culture, there was almost like a grieving process. So you'd had this a set amount of time where you'd be grieving, but it would be, for the want of a better word, full on grief. So there were really they were expressing their grief and they weren't keeping it in. And the idea was that, once they've done that, once the period of time, I can't remember the exact period of time it was, but once that has elapsed, the idea is that they could almost move forward. So really, really interesting. But what happens is we don't then have the tools to deal with it when it does happen. Whether that's in the context of writing our will or thinking about it, but also if we experience it, how do we know how to deal with it unless it's happened before? And yet it's something that that's guaranteed. It will happen to all of us. We all have this in common. One of a few certainties in life. We will all die at some point. And by not having these conversations, it's then putting that barrier in the way and stopping us from making a will and making our powers of attorney. And I talked a little bit about this at the beginning. This is what happened to me. And so I reached a certain age, which the picture there is illustrating. That this was a few years ago, I should say. I just noticed as well in the picture I do have hair. So it was quite a few years ago, but I reached this certain point, and surprisingly, I hadn't really thought about this, considering the work I do, and I've been doing for many years before I reached this point. And it was doing my first will, but then that needed updating because things would change in life. And it wasn't until I'd really focused in on, okay, at some point I am going to pass away, but what does that mean? Well, it was a way of engaging with death, so I could live in the present moment and really focus on, well, what do I want to do in my life? And what's really important to me and what brings me joy. And it did coincide with what's happened over the last few years in the world. And it was a prompt for me to move into self-employment, to take that leap, which then led to lots of different things. It was a way of focusing in on, how do I really want to live my life? It's given me courage to do that because I was having these conversations and this realization that, okay, one day I will die. But also it just help us to connect us with our loved ones. We don't want to be worrying about what's going to happen to our loved ones. We want to make sure that they're safe and they're secure. So having these conversations, it will bring us closer. And surprisingly, it is an interesting subject to talk about. Once you do start the conversations, people really do, from my experience, they really do get into it, and it does lead into lots of different areas. And these are just some pictures of the things I've been doing over the last few years, and all come about, really focusing in on having these conversations with people. So I can go out and enjoy what I was doing and really embrace the moment and not worrying about all the what ifs and what people think. So really quite powerful. So it's a really good way of reflecting, slowing down and actually focusing on what do we really want? Giving ourselves permission to have those conversations, to think about these issues and talk to the people closest to us. But it may be that you might not be comfortable speaking to people who you are closest to. It might be that speaking to a professional when you're making wills and powers of attorney might be a little bit more comfortable. But also it will start that process of talking about it, which then may lead up to then, okay, I can speak about this with my loved ones. And, I mentioned there, not having the regrets when we die. and protecting those that we leave behind. And once we've taken those 2 steps, so we're planning, we're having those important conversations, it begins to come together. You and your loved ones, you will know what to do because you've talked about it. You know how to get started. We're putting the protections in place because you'll know what you will need and how to approach it. And it gets so much easier. Now, these 2 areas will bring it all together and make it so much easier to get it done. And this is what I helped Sandra with. So with Sandra, she needed to actually update her will and make lasting powers of attorney. And there was a few things going on with Sandra. So wanting to downsize and move house. There's real concern about burdening her 2 friends. So she didn't have any close relations who she could trust. She wanted the people closest to her to be her executors in the will, so the people who will deal with your estate and deal with the wishes in your will, and also your attorneys in your lasting powers of attorney, so the people who are going to make decisions for you. I was really worried about, okay, I don't want to burden them with all of this. I want to make sure that they understand as much as I do, and they know what they're doing, but they don't feel as if they've been left out. So we had conversations with all 3 of them. So Sandra's friends did need that guidance. So as I say, it was a way of making sure they understood what their role was, what their responsibilities were. So when they were called into action, they didn't feel lost. They knew what they were doing, and they weren't worrying about making mistakes or having to find out what they can and can't do. And we actually recorded this as well. So as well as having those discussions, we recorded it within the powers of attorney, within our letters of wishes, and almost worked out this plan. So there was this feeling that Sandra weren't overburdening her friends, and they knew exactly what was expected of them. So at the end of this session, I'm going to be offering a chance to speak with me, and we'll talk through creating your own plan. So having to think about who we can have conversations with, getting some clarity with all of this, and pulling this plan together. So there is a QR code there which you can book a call in with me. So a short session, and we'll go through all of these things. So that QR code will be on the slides as I move forward with the workshops. If you do at any point would like to do that, you can use that QR code to point it on the screen as usual. Okay, so my top tips for protection then. So give some context. So wills and powers of attorney, they are very individualistic. Sometimes it is a case of, okay, I can't see the context, but somebody else may be able to see that for me. And see this process as more than our legal documents. It is a way of really opening up discussions, thinking about what do I really want, exploring all of the issues, and then having those conversations, engaging with death, live our best life. And then ultimately we can actually decide to do it. And most won't get this far. And I think you may have seen statistics about the number of people not making wills. It does vary, and I think it must be so difficult to get an accurate picture of this. But often the figures that are floated around are 2/3 don't have wills in place. A lot more with lasting powers of attorney, that's for sure. So it's a huge portion of the population. So that's the end of part 1. Okay, I'm just going to take a sip of water, give you a moment just to reflect. Hopefully that's been useful. And let me know if it has in the chat. And it's an important starting point to make sure that we get the correct advice for you. I've touched upon this briefly already, and we want the will and we want our lasting powers of attorney to do what we need them to do. And this is what part 2 is all about. So it's focusing in on what we need to do to get them tailored for our own individual circumstances, putting it all in place. And this is the area that the majority of people I speak to, they get wrong. And some of these actions are not helping them to be able to do the wills and to do the powers of attorney. So they're taking ineffective actions when it comes to making wills and powers of attorney. And there are 2 things that we need to do with this section. So we need to implement, and then communication and action. And I'll explain and delve into that into more detail. And there are actually 2 elements to implementing. So we have deep dive and we have getting help. So what do we mean by deep dive? This is the first thing to have a think about. And it's this concept of why. So what I realized was a lot of the time people would come to me and there was a particular reason why they wanted to make a will or wanted to make a power of attorney. And that was usually because something was happening in their life. So it wasn't necessarily about dying, ironically. So really having to think about, well, why do I want to make a will? Why do I want to make a lasting power of attorney? What's driving me to do it? And there are lots of reasons, and I'll go through some of those in a moment. This why concept is, you may have come across this before, we hear it a lot, from a professional point of view, why do we do what we do in life? Why do we do the career we do? And as I say, there are some similarities with putting these protections in place and making our wills and powers of attorney. And it may be that it is about protection, protecting, as I've mentioned before, our children, our partner, our business. It might be to save tax. Inheritance tax, again, seems to be in the news quite a lot. Are we going to see any changes? It might be to exclude somebody from our will. Again, we often see in the news stories about people being excluded from a will, making a claim against the will because they feel they should have been part of that will and inherit. But this may come about because of difficult relationships, for example. There may be genuine reasons why we do want to exclude somebody. It might be divorce. It might be recently married or entering into a civil partnership. It could be a new relationship. Things could change when we enter a relationship. We may have children from a previous relationship, which means that we really need to focus in on the will. What does that mean for me? Why am I doing this and what's important? It might be protecting our assets from care costs in later life. Certainly an area to think about. Sometimes people close to us have passed away, so that really gets us thinking about, okay, I really need to do this myself now. And I mentioned a moment ago, making sure our assets go to the correct people. It's a really useful way of organising our finances generally. When we're doing our wills and we're doing our powers of attorney, we are exploring what's happening in our life, how are our finances. So if we can get that aspect of financial well-being as well, then it's another bonus. Okay. We might be worried about what happens if we become ill. We saw that with John Paul and Ben. And ultimately, it's having this security and peace of mind. But also, we don't want to lose control over what happens when we pass away. And again, I see this a lot, hear this a lot from clients I help. there is this element of, I feel that I am going to lose a bit of control. And if we remember this diagram from earlier, this is the complexities. Okay, so have a think about your why. So what's pushing us to make our wills and powers of attorney? What's happening in our life, which means that we really need to do this? So the second part of this then is to get help. And unfortunately, most think that we can make a will ourselves, or we take a substandard option. And I talked earlier about the different levels of, or the different types of service when it comes to will making. But also, they speak with family and friends who've done it before. The problem is that is about their own situation. So information gets a little bit, it's skewed, so it's not focused on you. It might get misinterpreted. And then we may ask Google. I mean, I'm certainly guilty of this. We always ask Google for information. But the problem with that is it is the wrong advice because it's generic. It's not focused on our own circumstances. And in order for our wills and our powers of attorney, in order for them to be correct, we want to get the most out of them. It needs to be tailored to you. And arguably, it is one of the most important legal services you will ever use. If we think about, well, what does it actually do? It's protecting our loved ones. It's protecting our property and our assets, our money. It's protecting our business if we have one, or our income and finances. And again, I've mentioned it before, legal advice is needed so we can ensure that our wills, our powers of attorney, they are legally binding, they are going to work, and they are worthless without advice. They are just a document unless we have that specific advice. And I know there will be situations where people can't make a will through a professional, for a lawyer, whoever it may be, you know, and that is a positive where we do have these different services. But wherever we can, getting the advice is going to be key to all of this. And when we don't get the advice, this is when we do risk it going wrong. So I have another scenario here. So an example from a client I've helped in the past, which is Tim. So Tim's story was I'd made a homemade will, and they'd actually gone to one of these DIY packs from Smith's. I think you can still get them probably online. But when he did the will, the correct formalities were not used, so it wasn't signed and witnessed in the correct way. And that meant that the will was not legally binding. Why that was important was because Tim wanted to leave his house to a friend. But if he hadn't have made the will and leave it to a friend, and because the will was invalid, it meant that the house passed to his distant relatives. So we saw that diagram from earlier. What happens if you don't have a will? Because Tim had lots of different relatives, he didn't speak with them, the house passed to them rather than to his friend, which is actually what he wanted. And another example, and this is in relation to lasting powers of attorney, is Mike and his father. And so Mike had decided to make lasting powers of attorney again themselves. But by the time they were doing this, his father had dementia, which was worsening. And they needed to be able to, so Mike needed to be able to help his father make decisions about finances, about care, needed to access bank accounts, which would enable the right care to be put into place to make sure that his father could be looked after. And unfortunately, his father lacked mental capacity. So because of his dementia, it meant that his decision-making ability was impaired. So he lacked what we refer to as mental capacity. So he was unable, or there was the possibility that he would be unable to make a lasting powers of attorney. But what actually happened was that I was able to help them arrange a mental capacity assessment. So that supported Mike and his father to be able to make the powers of attorney because Mike's father's mental capacity was being assessed by somebody who was very familiar with doing that. And they did actually find that Mike's father did have mental capacity to make the powers of attorney. So he was able to do them. So Mike was then able to help his dad manage his finances, sort out care, pay for his bills, and make those decisions for him, those really important decisions about medical. It could be care decisions. It could even be day-to-day decisions as well as the finances. And when we don't have a lasting power of attorney, we would then need to apply to the Court of Protection. And I've helped lots of clients to apply to the Court of Protection. So it is a court who help people who lack mental capacity. So if you've reached a point where you can't make a lasting power of attorney, then it would be a case of applying to be what we call a deputy, which is the equivalent under a lasting power of attorney. So, but the issue with that is it will take some time. There are lots of delays, there are lots of things going on at the moment in terms of powers of attorney and Court of Protection, which does point to making them as early as possible, because we are seeing lots of delays within the court, within the government department who deals with powers of attorney, with registering them. So if you can make them earlier rather than later, then it will save the risk then of being in a position where you need some legal authority, but you haven't got that because you've either just started to make a power of attorney or you can't now make a lasting power of attorney. Okay, so the other thing I mentioned then that we need to do is communication and action. And this, again, it comes back to this point about instead of speaking to people and asking Google, which will give us generic advice, it won't be tailored to you. If we spend some time just writing out a list of questions that are actually important to you, so just have a think about all the things that you need to know, whatever it may be, and jot that down. And it'll be so useful, be able to get the most out of when it comes to making the will and power of attorney, be able to get the most out of that experience if we do this before. It's a really, really useful exercise. And this is what I helped Jill with. So I actually sent her a checklist of specific points to consider. There's a few things going on for Jill, and this really helped to draw out the information, and that allowed me to tailor the advice to Jill. We could really uncover Jill's priorities. And with Jill, there was actually some friction within the family. She was due to marry. She had children from previous relationships. So she really needed to make sure, okay, what do I want to happen? What's best here? How can I protect everybody who are important to me? What do I need to do? So that brings me to the end of this section. So my top tips for support then. So I mentioned this a few times, really think about your why. Remember that it needs to be tailored to you. And ultimately, DIY approach could cost more in the long run. And wills, powers of attorney, they are very individualistic. And this generic advice won't relate to our own circumstances. And then also just keep in mind the importance of what we're doing. And once you've done all that, we can then look at making decisions. So putting all this together, putting it into action so we can actually go through, we can make our powers of attorney, we can get them done, they're not left unfinished. And the truth is, and I've touched upon this before, most will take a shortcut. They think they can do it themselves, so DIY options, don't take legal advice, and then thinking it's a simple thing to do. So it doesn't actually get the right attention. We're not spending enough time really focusing in on how can it make a difference in our life. And there is a better and easier way of this, and this is the process I use with my clients. And it's probably better to illustrate again with an example. And I've done this with Steve and Sue. There are lots of things happening for Steve and Sue. So they were unmarried partners, children from previous relationships. They had joint and sole assets. There were a number of extended family issues they wanted to really think about. And they were business owners as well, and also a professional. And through a combination of bringing all this information I talked about today, so going through the planning stages, going through the initial fact find, and then the one-to-one support, we could uncover the why. So why was Steve and Sue doing this? What was really important to them? We could then work out all the different aspects of making a will. So inheritance tax, what assets are part of our will, look at any changes to how our assets need to be owned in order to protect them, think about the structure of our will, and then consider what will happen to the business if they were to die and who will look after it ultimately. And going back to the family tree, so this is a good illustration of why the family tree is really important, because it enabled me to get a really full picture of the family, who the loved ones were, who were most important, identify who was to be included in the will, work out who got what, we could prioritize, and just have a think about the legal implications as well. So with Steve and Sue being unmarried, if they didn't have a will in place, that would cause difficulties. But also if they did get married in the future, well, what's going to happen to the will? So a will be invalidated if we have one and we then later marry or enter into a civil partnership. And we took similar steps with the powers of attorney. So again, we had some planning to do, needed to think about the business. We needed to really focus in on who the attorneys were going to be, who were able to do this for them, understand what they needed and what Steve and Sue's wishes were, really focusing on the medical decisions as well. Another important aspect was digital assets, and an area which sometimes gets missed, in all honesty. So if I'm helping clients update their will, for example, that's been done somewhere else, sometimes this is an area that hasn't been considered. So thinking about our social media accounts, how can we, do we want to protect them when we die? Do we want to save any photographs, any contacts on there that we may have, whatever it may be? and all the other things that we have in the digital world. So a really important part. And all this work so enabled me to draw up wills, powers of attorney. They were tailored specifically for Steve and Sue. Okay. And they had all the correct legal documents in place. Their assets, their loved ones and family were secure. The wishes were recorded. Everybody knew exactly what they wanted. The assets were going to the correct people. We considered the other points as well. The business can continue. Finances were in order, and they had peace of mind and ultimately less stress. And they were more open to talking about death and ill health because they'd had those conversations. And also I offered a free review. So updating a will, really important. Our circumstances will change. So they had a free 30-minute review within 2 years of drawing up the wills and powers of attorney. It was just a way to check, make sure everything is in order. So my top tips for decisions then. So I've mentioned it before. Take the time to really think about the why. Enjoy the process. It's a good distraction from all the other distractions in the modern world. And then if we get the process right, we can then focus in on the good things. We're not worrying about what's going to happen. We've got our protections in place. We're not procrastinating about it. Don't take the DIY approach. So it does need a tailored approach. It needs the will and power of attorney to be tailored to us. And then things will change, update it every couple of years. Doesn't mean you need to change the will, but it's useful to go through that exercise. So for peace of mind, protection and security, for our loved ones, assets, or business, if we have one, we want to have a tailored solution, advice which is specifically about us. No mistakes. So we know that those that are left behind, they won't have any difficulties, making sure that they don't need to worry. And then if we follow this process, we're not leaving it to chance, so we can make sure we have those protections in place. So I mentioned earlier, if this is something which sounds really good for you, you want to explore, you want some personal help and support through the process of making wills and powers of attorney, you just want to have a conversation around, we'll talk through exact circumstances. We want to be able to gain some clarity. We want to pinpoint your why, and then we want to have an action plan and then get the ball rolling. So I've opened up some calls and it's on a first come, first served basis. So the QR code is there. I'll just bring up there we go. There's a larger version there. So if you'd like to book a call in with me, use the QR code, use the camera on the screen, and I'd love to chat. Let's have a think about what you'd like to do. As I say, think about your why, put an action plan in place. I think the sooner we can do it, the better. As I mentioned before, there is perhaps a misconception with wills and powers of attorney that we don't do them until later life. I think we are seeing lots of people doing them at all ages, which is just fantastic. But we don't, ultimately, we don't really know what's going to happen to us, and when it's going to happen. We know, unfortunately, passing away is inevitable. We don't know when that's going to happen. So we are running over a little bit, so I will take some questions. So if anybody does have any questions, pop them into the Q&A for me. I think we've got one in there already, so we'll have a look at that. But if you do need to go, thank you so much for joining me. As I say, we'll be hanging around for 5-10 minutes to answer any questions, so please do feel free to stay on. But as I say, if you do need to go, then thank you so much for joining me today. And I'll just leave that QR code and the link to booking a call for me, so it will go through to my calendar and you can actually book that in. So let's just have a look then at any questions. Let's have a look. So we've got a question coming in about costs involved with setting wills and powers of attorney out. So yeah, so great question. What I will say to all people, let's have a conversation first. So book a call in me and we can talk through the costs involved. Because it is tailored to you, it may well be different. So it's always better to have a call and just work out what you'd like to do, and then I can go through the costs involved. Okay, but yeah, no, good point and good question. So if there are any more questions, as I say, do feel free to pop them in the Q&A for me. I will be staying on for a few more moments. But thank you once again for joining me on this workshop. And it has been recorded, so I will be sending out the replay to everybody who's registered. So that will be circulated as well. So I'll just, as I say, hang on in case there are any more questions coming through. But do enjoy the rest of your day. And as I was saying earlier, top tips I can leave you with is really have a think about the why. So what's happening in your life to push you forward to make wills and powers of attorney. Have those important conversations, speak to people, really talk about it. It really does. It does help when it comes to all of this. And I know it's difficult, but if we can just start, that's it. It will become easier. And actually, sometimes, that might be starting the conversation with me or whoever you are making wills and powers of attorney with. Okay, so I don't think there are any more questions coming through by the looks of it. So once again, thank you for those who have stayed on the call. Thank you for joining me. Have a great rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of the week. And feel free to book a call in with me if I can help going forward. So, bye for now.